Imagine you're driving through a tunnel, not through a mountain, under the Atlantic Ocean, 72 meters below the sea. Then suddenly, you hit a roundabout. Not a metaphor, not a tourist attraction, an actual traffic roundabout, beneath the ocean. But here's the crazy part. That's not even the weirdest thing about this place. This is 18 islands sitting in the middle of the North Atlantic, halfway between Norway and Iceland, battered by wind every single day of the year, home to just over 50,000 people. No trees tall enough to give you shade. Yet somehow, it's one of the wealthiest, safest, most functional places on Earth. Unemployment is basically 1%. Almost nobody locks their doors. The Prime Minister's personal phone number is publicly listed. If you want to call him, you can. There's no McDonald's, no rush hour, fewer than a dozen traffic lights in the entire country. The sheep have the right of way. This is the Faroe Islands. Once you understand what's actually going on here, you're going to look at the word civilization completely differently. So first, where are these islands? Most people have no idea. Pull up a map of the North Atlantic. Find Iceland. Find Norway. Find Scotland. Now look at the empty space between all three. Yeah, that's it. 18 small islands formed by volcanic eruptions millions of years ago, rising out of one of the most violent stretches of ocean on the planet. The landscape doesn't look real. Green mountains rise straight out of the ocean. Black cliffs drop hundreds of feet into crashing waves. It looks less like a real country and more like somebody accidentally built Skyrim in the middle of the Atlantic. There are almost no tall trees. The wind comes off the sea year-round, carrying salt, and anything that tries to grow tall just gets knocked sideways. The weather... The Faroese have a saying, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. That is not a joke. A morning that starts sunny can turn into a wall of white fog, then driving rain, then wind strong enough to lean into, all before lunch. The clouds don't just move across the sky here. They sit on the islands. They roll down the hillsides. They swallow entire villages. In summer, it never fully gets dark. In winter, there's a few short hours of gray light, and then darkness again. The kind of darkness that arrives early and stays late. Yet somehow, generation after generation, people stayed. And that decision eventually led to one of the strangest engineering projects on Earth. Now here's where name comes in, because it tells you a lot. Faroe comes directly from the Old Norse word for sheep. The Faroe Islands literally means the sheep islands. Sheep are everywhere here. They graze on hillsides. They wander onto roads. They eat the grass off the roofs of houses, because traditional Faroese buildings have living turf roofs, and sheep just do that. Drivers don't honk. They don't get mad. They stop, they wait, they let the sheep cross. That tells you everything about the rhythm of life here. The island were first settled around the 9th century, the Viking Age, by people from Scandinavia and the British Isles. They brought with them a language descended from Old Norse, a culture built around the sea, and honestly a wild tolerance for conditions that would make most of us leave immediately. That language, Faroese, is still spoken today, by everyone, by kids in school, by grandparents who never left. In a world where hundreds of languages have just disappeared, where entire ways of thinking vanished because the last fluent speaker died, Faroese survived. But surviving wasn't enough. They wanted it to thrive. Here's something that'll change how you think about cultural preservation. Faroese is spoken by around 70,000 to 80,000 people worldwide. That's it, one of the smaller languages on Earth. For a long time, that made it basically invisible to tech companies. When Google Translate built its language library, Faroese was included. The algorithm looked at the number of speakers and just moved on. So here's what the Faroese did. They built it themselves. Volunteers and local officials manually recorded spoken phrases. They captured the sounds, the patterns, the grammar, not waiting for a tech giant to decide they were worth the effort. They created the data from scratch. That mindset, if nobody else is going to do it, we'll do it ourselves, shows up everywhere in the Faroe Islands. It applies to language. As we're about to see, it applies to roads. Okay, this is where things get kind of insane. 18 islands, which means historically, getting from one island to another meant a boat, a ferry, or just waiting for the weather to cooperate. In the North Atlantic, where the weather frequently does not cooperate. So what did the Faroese do? They drilled through mountains, under the ocean floor, connecting islands that were never supposed to be connected by road. There are now more than 17 land tunnels and 4 undersea tunnels running through and beneath these islands. The underwater tunnels alone stretch more than 33 kilometers, roughly 20 miles, under the sea. Think about that for a second. 53,000 people, fewer than most mid-sized cities. They built 4 tunnels under the Atlantic Ocean. But here's the part that breaks people's brains. In 2020, the Faroe Islands opened the Eysturoy Tunnel, an 11-kilometer undersea tunnel connecting the 2 most populated islands. At its deepest point, you are driving 187 meters below the surface of the sea. Then, the Faroese did something nobody had ever done before. They built the world's first undersea roundabout, a traffic circle, at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, a roundabout. It wasn't built as a stunt. It wasn't built as a monument. It was built because that's the logical point where traffic needs to split in 2 directions. So they just put a roundabout there. The central pillar is made of natural rock left over from the blasting process. A Faroese artist covered it in full-size figures holding hands, echoing the traditional chain dance of the islands, lit in blue and green light. People now drive into a tunnel beneath the ocean specifically to see it. The most practical construction project in the country accidentally became one of its top tourist attractions. Thanks to these tunnels, more than 90% of the Faroese population can now reach each other by road, across islands that were cut off from each other for centuries. Though we're 18 islands, a Visit Faroe Islands spokesperson once said, "We often joke that we defy the fact that we are islands." They really do. Here's the part that really doesn't make sense. These islands are richer than most of Europe. Seriously, GDP per person sits around $74,000. That's higher than Denmark, the country they're technically part of, higher than most of Western Europe, higher than the UK. Unemployment is around 1%. At its lowest, it touched 0.7%. Most developed countries consider 4 to 5% unemployment healthy and normal. The Faroe Islands have basically made unemployment a rounding error. How? Fish. That's it. Fishing and salmon farming account for around 90% of all exports. They don't just catch fish, they process it, package it, distribute it. They control nearly the entire chain. No major tourism industry, no financial sector, no tech companies, no multinational headquarters. One product, the sea and what lives in it. They turn that one product into one of the most stable economies on Earth. Taxes are high. Cost of living is high. Almost everything gets imported across that rough ocean, but the incomes match. The result is a place where almost everyone has work. Almost everyone can afford to live, and almost nobody is desperate. None of it required McDonald's. Here's the detail that's hardest to explain if you haven't been here. People do not lock their doors. Not as a figure of speech. Not in safe neighborhoods. As a general, everyday reality, doors are unlocked. Serious crime is extremely rare. Pollution is virtually non-existent. One immigrant from Thailand described the experience of living here as something she genuinely never felt before. A sense that the world around you just isn't threatening. The small scale changes everything. The Prime Minister's personal phone number is publicly available. If you have a problem, you can call. It's not a campaign promise. It's just practical reality when you're governing 53,000 people in a place where everyone's a few connections away from knowing everyone else. Fewer than a dozen traffic lights. Total, in the whole country. One university, one airport, one TV station. Rush hour doesn't exist. A village called Gassadler has 16 residents. 16. That's a small office meeting. It has grass roof houses. Not for aesthetics, but because turf insulates against wind better than almost anything else. Social life here isn't built around restaurants or malls or apps. Small kitchens, simple meals, conversations that go long because there's no particular rush to be anywhere. That's not poverty. That's not backwardness. That's a place that never built its identity around consumption. Two more things you need to know, because they say more than any statistic can. First, the food. The Faroese still practice traditional preservation methods going back centuries. Fermented lamb, air-dried by ocean wind, cured by salt in the air, is still made and eaten today, not as a novelty, not as a heritage tourism experience, as actual food, prepared the same way their grandparents did and their grandparents before them. It's intense, it's specific, not for everyone. It's a direct, unbroken thread back to when that wind and that salt were the only refrigeration available. Second, the chain dance. The traditional Faroese chain dance has been kept alive here when similar traditions died almost everywhere else the Vikings settled. No stage, no instruments, just people holding hands in a circle, stepping together to a rhythm, singing old ballads, long sagas, stories of ancestors that people still know, still sing, still step to. It's a memory system, a way of feeling connected to each other and everyone who ever danced in that same circle. In a world where cultural traditions are increasingly something you read about rather than do, the Faroese just kept dancing. Now, before this starts sounding like some kind of Nordic utopia, we need to talk about the problems. First, the population problem. The main industries here, fishing, aquaculture, have historically been male-dominated. Many young women leave the islands to study abroad. A lot of them never come back, which means some villages are literally running out of potential partners. There's a measurable gap, roughly 1,800 more men than women, out of a total population of 53,000. To build families, many Faroese men have looked outside the islands. There are currently over 300 women from Thailand and the Philippines living here, adapting to one of the most extreme climate shifts imaginable, building lives in a place that couldn't be more different from where they grew up. That story, immigration, adaptation, what it means to call a place home, is playing out quietly in small kitchens, in villages the world has never heard of. Second, the controversy. Whaling. The Faroese practice a form of traditional whale and dolphin hunting that's existed here for generations. Historically, it was survival, feeding communities through winter on islands where food was scarce. Today, it's one of the most controversial practices associated with any small nation on Earth. Animal welfare organizations protest it loudly. International media covers it with horror. The Faroese don't apologize for it. They also don't expect the world to accept it. That tension between tradition and modernity, between internal identity and external judgment, is something every culture navigates. The Faroe Islands just do it more publicly than most. Third, tourism. The islands are blown up on social media. Cliffs, fog, waterfalls, sheep. More people want to come. The Faroese made a choice most tourist economies would never make. They said no, or at least not that many. They've temporarily closed sections of the islands to visitors, not to block tourism, but to let the landscape recover, to repair what feet and cameras do to terrain that was never designed for crowds. They're protecting the thing that makes the Faroe Islands worth protecting, even when it costs them money. Think about this before you go. Most of us live in systems we didn't design and don't fully understand. We drive on roads someone else built. We shop in stores stocked by supply chains we've never seen. The Faroese built their infrastructure on purpose. With a population the size of a medium-sized town, they drilled tunnels under the Atlantic Ocean. Because that was a logical solution to the problem of geography. They saw their language disappearing and said, "We'll build the database ourselves." They saw tourism threatening their landscape and said, "We'll close the trail." They looked at the forces that erase small cultures and decided, "We'll keep dancing." In a world where everyone seems to be racing toward the future, the Faroe Islands did something different. They decided some things were worth keeping. Whispers, there's a roundabout at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, a real traffic circle, beneath the sea, on an island that barely shows up on most maps. The sheep still have the right of way. Tonight, somewhere in the Faroe Islands, in a village of 16 people, a kitchen light is on. Someone is eating fermented lamb, talking about something small and specific and utterly their own. They're not waiting for the world to discover them. They're not trying to become the world. They've already decided who they are. Against the wind, against the ocean, against the odds. It worked.